It wasn't a parking ticket. It was a letter sealed in silence, written by someone who once meant everything. As he read it, Stallone's knees gave out, and for the first time in years, he let himself feel what he buried long ago. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The old pickup truck, a relic from an era when steel was thick and chrome meant something, sat parked on a quiet side street, dappled by the late afternoon sun filtering through the thinning leaves. He approached it slowly, his gait measured, the slight stiffness in his shoulders betraying a life lived with intention and more than a few hard knocks. His face, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind and long introspection, was impassive, his eyes, the color of a storm-weathered sky, taking in the familiar surroundings with a practiced scan that missed nothing yet revealed little of his own thoughts. He wore a faded denim jacket over a plain, dark shirt, clothes chosen for comfort and utility, not for show. In his right hand, he carried a small, worn leather satchel, its contents known only to him, a private collection of necessities and perhaps a memory or two. As he reached the driver's side door, his gaze caught something out of place, a pale rectangle tucked under the truck's windshield wiper. A letter. He paused, his hand hovering just above the door handle. It wasn't a parking ticket. The envelope was too personal, the paper of a heavier stock. There was no official insignia, no printed return address, just the stark white against the dusty glass. A frown, so subtle it was almost imperceptible, creased the skin between his brows. He rarely received unexpected communications. His life pared down to a few essential connections, a deliberate retreat from the noise of a world that too often spoke without saying anything of value. He reached out, his calloused fingers, more accustomed to the grip of tools or the feel of worn leather, gently plucking the envelope from its perch. It was sealed, addressed simply with a single bold initial that he recognized, though from where the memory remained stubbornly veiled, like a name on the tip of his tongue. He turned it over in his hand. No return address, just the weight of it, surprisingly substantial, promising more than a casual note. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he let his eyes drift down the quiet street. The row of old houses, their porches shadowed, their windows like watching eyes, the cracked sidewalk where weeds pushed through with stubborn resilience, the distant sound of a dog barking, a child's laughter. It was a scene of ordinary life, a life he observed more than participated in. The letter felt like an intrusion, a stone dropped into the still pool of his carefully curated solitude. He ran a thumb over the seal, the paper smooth beneath his touch. Inside his jacket pocket, his other hand closed around a small, smooth object, a piece of sea-worn wood he'd carried for years, its edges softened by time and tide, a private talisman whose significance was his alone. He let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes before diving into cold water. Then, with a decisive movement, he pulled open the truck's heavy door, the groan of old hinges a familiar sound, and slid onto the worn bench seat. The interior smelled faintly of oil, old coffee, and something uniquely his own, a scent of quiet endurance. He laid the letter on his lap, staring at it for another long moment, the silence in the cab broken only by the ticking of the ancient dashboard clock, a sound that seemed to measure not just time, but the weight of unspoken words. The sun, now lower in the sky, cast long shadows across the street, and a chill began to creep into the air. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this letter, whatever its contents, was not something to be taken lightly. It had found him, sought him out, and it demanded to be heard. The weight of the past, he knew, often arrived in the most unassuming of packages. He wondered, not for the first time, if some doors were better left unopened, some silences better left unbroken. But the letter was there, a tangible presence, a question mark against the familiar landscape of his life. And he was a man who, despite his preference for quiet, had never shied away from facing what needed to be faced. He continued to study the envelope, the single, stark initial almost a challenge. His mind, a repository of carefully filed memories, sifted through possibilities, faces, voices from the past. The initial was common enough, yet tied to a specific context, it could unlock a particular door. He considered the handwriting on the front, strong, deliberate strokes, yet with a slight tremor that hinted at age or perhaps emotion. It wasn't instantly recognizable, but it resonated with a faint, almost subliminal familiarity, like a half-forgotten song. He took another slow, deliberate breath, bracing himself. Some messages, he knew, were best received in solitude, where the world could not intrude on the raw unfolding of truth. The cab of his old truck, a space that had been his sanctuary on countless journeys, felt appropriate. He picked up the letter. His fingers, usually so steady, fumbled slightly with the flap. The paper was thick, expensive, not the kind one used for casual correspondence. This was a message of import, of carefully chosen words. He finally broke the seal, the sound a small, tearing whisper in the quiet cab. He unfolded the single sheet of paper. The same strong, slightly tremulous handwriting covered the page, dense blocks of text that promised a lengthy accounting. He held the letter in both hands, the sea-worn piece of wood in his pocket a small, hard knot against his thigh. His eyes scanned the first few lines. To the man I knew, it began a formal, almost archaic address that immediately set a somber tone. It has been many years, more than either of us would care to count, I imagine. I write this not to dredge up old sorrows, nor to seek forgiveness, for some things are perhaps beyond that. I write because silence, I have learned, can become a heavier burden than any truth, however painful. He paused, his gaze lifting from the page to stare unseeingly through the windshield. Old sorrows. The words echoed in the quiet space of his mind. His life had known its share of them, carefully weathered, integrated into the man he had become, but never entirely forgotten. They were like old injuries, sometimes flaring up with a change in the emotional weather. He read on. The next paragraph introduced the writer by name, a name that struck him with the force of an unexpected blow, a name he had not heard spoken, nor allowed himself to think for decades. His breath hitched, his knuckles, gripping the letter, whitened. The world outside the truck, the quiet street, the fading light, the distant sounds of life, receded as if a curtain had fallen. He was suddenly back in another time, another place, a landscape of memory he had long believed to be sealed off, inaccessible. The air in the cab seemed to grow thick, heavy, charged with the sudden, potent presence of the past. His heart, usually a steady, reliable drum, began to beat a little faster, a little harder. The small piece of wood in his pocket felt like a burning coal. It was a relic from that same lost time, a tangible link to the very person whose words now lay before him, stark and unyielding on the page. He had believed that chapter of his life closed, the book shut, gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. But the past, he was learning yet again, had a way of finding you, of demanding a reckoning, even when you thought you had outrun it, outlived it, or simply buried it too deep to be disturbed. The letter was a ghost, risen from a grave he had dug himself, and it had come to speak. His eyes, narrowed against a sudden, internal glare, returned to the page, drawn by an irresistible, almost painful compulsion. The words swam before him for a moment, then sharpened into focus. The letter continued, not with accusations, but with a quiet, almost detached recounting of events. Events he remembered with a clarity that seared. It spoke of a shared history, of dreams that had once burned bright, and of a turning point, a moment of crisis that had fractured their world, sending them down divergent, solitary paths. I have carried the weight of that time like a stone in my heart, the letter read. There were things unsaid, misunderstandings that took root and grew into a forest of silence between us. I believe, then, that my silence was a shield for both of us. I see now it was a wall. A tremor ran through his hands. He remembered the silence, yes. A vast, echoing silence that had swallowed words, intentions, even love. He had built his own walls in response, thick and high, designed to keep the world out, but also, he realized now, to keep his own grief in. The letter described a scene, a particular day, with details so vivid they were like shards of glass in his memory. The quality of the light, the scent of rain on dry earth, a snatch of a song on a distant radio, a casual remark that had, in retrospect, been laden with unspoken meaning. He could see it all, feel it all, as if no time had passed. The small piece of wood in his pocket, he had found it on that very day, on a desolate stretch of coastline where they had sought solace, or perhaps an escape from a world that was closing in on them. He had picked it up, drawn by its smooth, battered resilience, a tiny piece of flotsam that had survived the fury of the ocean. It had become a symbol for him, though of what, he had never quite been able to articulate, even to himself. Perhaps it was a symbol of endurance, or of loss, or simply of a day when everything changed. The letter continued, its tone shifting, becoming more personal, more vulnerable. I need you to know, it said, that my choices, however they may have appeared, were not born of malice, nor of indifference. They were born of fear, of a desperate, misguided attempt to protect what I held most dear, even if it meant sacrificing a part of myself, a part of us. Fear. He understood fear. He had known it intimately, wrestled with it in the long, dark nights of the soul. But he had never associated it with this person, this figure from his past who had always seemed so strong, so unbreakable. The revelation was like a crack appearing in a long-held, unexamined belief. The carefully constructed narrative of his past, the one he had lived with for so long, was beginning to crumble at the edges. The letter was not just a message. It was a key, unlocking rooms within him he had thought permanently sealed. Memories, emotions, questions he had suppressed for years began to surface, like bubbles rising from a deep, dark pool. The stoic mask he wore, the one that had served him so well for so long, was beginning to feel thin, fragile. The weight of the unread portion of the letter felt immense. He wasn't sure he could bear it, but he also knew he couldn't stop. The truth, however painful, had a right to be heard, and he, after all these years, had a right to hear it. The script of the letter became a landscape he traversed, each word a step deeper into a forgotten country. It spoke of regrets, not in a plea for absolution, but as a simple statement of fact, a burden carried alone for too long. There were moments, the writer confessed, when I nearly reached out, when the silence became unbearable. But pride, or perhaps it was shame, always held me back. The years stretched into decades, and the chasm between us seemed too wide to bridge. He could feel that chasm, had lived on its desolate edge for what felt like an eternity. He had told himself it was a necessary separation, a consequence of choices made, of paths irrevocably diverged. He had accepted it, or so he thought, as one accepts the changing of seasons, the inevitability of winter. But the letter was a thaw, a sudden, unexpected spring, and the ice around his heart was beginning to groan, to crack. The writer then moved to the core of the message. The reason for this sudden, unsettling reappearance after so many years of silence. It was not a request, not a demand. It was a story, a final piece of a puzzle he hadn't even realized was incomplete. It concerned a third person, someone deeply connected to them both, someone whose fate had been a source of unspoken anguish, a raw, unhealed wound in his own soul. The letter laid bare truths about this third person, truths the writer had kept hidden, believing it was for the best. I thought I was protecting you, protecting their memory, the letter stated, the handwriting becoming almost illegible in places, as if the effort of writing these words was immense. I see now that in trying to shield you from pain, I only prolonged it, added to it, made it a solitary burden when it should have been shared. The memento in his pocket, the piece of sea-worn wood, was now a burning ember against his skin. It was inextricably linked to this third person, a silent token of a love and a loss that had shaped the very contours of his life. He had carried it as a reminder, a penance, a secret comfort. Now, the letter was imbuing it with a new, almost unbearable significance. The words on the page were a relentless tide, washing away the foundations of the story he had told himself for years. The villain in his narrative was not a villain at all, but another soul struggling, flawed, making impossible choices in an impossible situation. The truth he had clung to was only a fragment, a shard of a much larger, more complex picture. The realization was staggering, disorienting. It was as if the ground beneath his feet, solid and familiar for so long, had suddenly turned to quicksand. His breath grew shallow. A tightness constricted his chest. The carefully constructed walls around his emotions, built stone by painstaking stone over decades of solitude, were beginning to tremble, to buckle under the relentless assault of this unexpected revelation. He could feel the pressure building, an immense, internal force that had been contained for too long. The letter wasn't just words on a page. It was a mirror, forcing him to confront not only the past, but the man he had become in its shadow. And the reflection was, for the first time in many years, deeply, profoundly unsettling. He read the final lines, his vision blurring, not from age, but from the unshed tears that were now stinging his eyes. I don't expect this to change anything between us, the letter concluded. Perhaps it is too late for that, but I could not carry this alone any longer. The truth, I find, has its own weight, its own timetable. It needed to be spoken. I hope one day you might find some peace in it, as I'm trying to find mine in the telling. Peace. The word seemed a cruel mockery in the face of the turmoil that was now raging within it. The letter slipped from his trembling fingers, fluttering onto the dusty floorboards of the truck. He didn't reach for it. He couldn't. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white, his arms rigid at his sides. The dam had broken. Decades of suppressed grief, of misunderstood sorrow, of unacknowledged pain surged through him with the force of a flash flood. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged gasp that was half sob, half roar of anguish. It was the sound of a man breaking, a man who had held himself together for too long, a man whose stoic facade had finally, catastrophically, shattered. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against the cold plastic of the steering wheel, his broad shoulders shaking with the violence of his emotion. Tears, hot and unrestrained, streamed down his weathered face, carving new, glistening paths through the dust of years. They were tears of loss, for the friend whose letter now lay at his feet, for the third person whose true story had finally been revealed, for the years wasted in silence and misunderstanding, for the parts of himself he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten they existed. The small piece of sea-worn wood, dislodged from his pocket by the intensity of his grief, clattered onto the dashboard, coming to rest near the old, ticking clock. He didn't notice. He was lost, adrift in a storm of emotion that threatened to consume him. The world outside the truck, with its muted colors and fading light, ceased to exist. There was only this, the raw, unadulterated agony of a heart breaking open after a lifetime of being closed. He pounded a fist against the steering wheel, a gesture of helpless rage, of profound, inarticulate sorrow. The sound was muffled, absorbed by the worn plastic. Why? The question screamed in his mind, though no words passed his lips. Why the silence? Why the years of needless pain? Why now after so long? The questions had no answers, or perhaps the answers were too complex, too human, too rooted in the flawed, frightened choices of people trying to navigate an unbearable reality. He raised his head, his face contorted, unrecognizable even to himself. He looked out through the tear-streaked windshield, but he saw nothing of the quiet street. He saw only the ghosts of the past, their faces accusing, pleading, forgiving. He felt a desperate need for air, for space. The confines of the truck cab, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. With a sudden, convulsive movement, he threw open the door, the old hinges groaning in protest, and stumbled out onto the sidewalk. He leaned against the cool, rough flank of the truck, his legs unsteady, his breath coming in ragged, tearing gasps. The late afternoon air, crisp and cool, did little to soothe the inferno within him. He was exposed, vulnerable, his carefully guarded inner world laid bare on a quiet suburban. The breakdown was complete, absolute. The man of iron will, of stoic endurance, was for this moment utterly, heartbreakingly human. The mask was gone, and what remained was raw, elemental grief, a testament to the enduring power of love, loss, and the devastating weight of unspoken truths. The letter had done its work. It had found its mark, and the life it had touched would never be quite the same. He stood there on the sidewalk, leaning heavily against the truck, the waves of emotion washing over him, receding, then surging again. The street was quiet, deserted at this late hour. A lone lamppost at the corner flickered on, casting a pale, anemic light that seemed to accentuate his isolation. His shoulders still shook, though the violent sobs had subsided into a series of shuddering breaths. He wiped his face with the back of a trembling hand, smearing the tears and the grime of the day. He felt hollowed out, emptied, as if something vital had been scoured from him. Yet, amidst the desolation, there was a strange, nascent sense of release, the faintest glimmer of a peace he hadn't known was possible. The burden of his carefully constructed past, with its silences and its certainties, had been lifted, and in its place, there was a raw, aching void, but also, perhaps, a space for something new to grow. A car turned the corner at the far end of the street, its headlights briefly sweeping over him before it continued on its way, its occupants oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding on the sidewalk. He was a solitary figure, a man wrestling with his ghosts in the encroaching twilight. He pushed himself away from the truck, his legs still unsteady. He took a few faltering steps, then stopped, looking down at the cracked pavement as if seeing it for the first time. The world seemed sharper, more vivid, yet also strangely distant, as if he were viewing it through a newly cleaned but unfamiliar lens. He thought of the letter, still lying on the floor of his truck. He thought of the words it contained, words that had dismantled his world, and perhaps, in doing so, offered him a chance to rebuild it on a foundation of truth. He bent down slowly, his joints protesting, and picked up a small, fallen leaf from the sidewalk. It was dry, brittle. Its vibrant autumn color faded to a dull brown. He turned it over in his fingers, its fragility a mirror of his own current state. He had always prided himself on his strength, his resilience, his ability to withstand whatever life threw at him. But this emotional onslaught had been different. It hadn't been a physical blow, but an internal one, striking at the very core of his being, at the carefully guarded sanctum of his heart. The piece of sea-worn wood was still on the dashboard of the truck. He could see its faint outline through the window. It seemed to call to him, a silent witness to his unraveling, a steadfast companion through years of unspoken grief. He knew he had to retrieve it and the letter. They were a part of him now, inextricably woven into the fabric of his story. The emotional storm had passed its peak, leaving behind a landscape of devastation, but also a strange, exhausted calm. The process of healing, he sensed, would be long and arduous, but it had begun. The first step, the acknowledgement of the wound, had been taken, forced upon him by the unexpected arrival of a voice from the past. He stood a little straighter, taking a deep, steadying breath. The air felt cool, clean in his lungs. The street was quiet again, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the slight evening breeze. He was alone, but perhaps for the first time in a very long time, not entirely solitary. The letter had broken a silence, and in doing so, it had forged a new, albeit painful, connection to a shared past, a shared humanity. He turned back to the truck, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man re-emerging into the world after a long illness. He opened the door, the sound of the hinges less jarring this time, almost a sigh. He leaned in, his eyes falling first on the letter, lying crumpled and tear-stained on the floor mat. He picked it up gently, smoothing out the worst of the creases with a careful hand. The words were still there, potent, life-altering. He didn't read them again, not yet. He simply held the paper, feeling its weight, its texture, the faint indentation of the pen's strokes. Then, his gaze shifted to the dashboard. The small piece of sea-worn wood lay there, innocuous, almost invisible in the dim light. He reached for it, his fingers closing around its familiar, smooth contours. It felt cool in his palm, a point of solidity in a world that had suddenly become fluid, uncertain. He had carried it for so long, a silent, unacknowledged monument to a grief he hadn't fully understood. Now, its meaning had been transformed, deepened, illuminated by the truths the letter had revealed. It was no longer just a symbol of loss, but also, perhaps, of endurance, of connection, of the possibility of understanding, even after decades of silence. He sat back down on the worn bench seat, the letter in one hand, the piece of wood in the other. The cab of the truck, which had felt like a tomb only moments before, now seemed a sanctuary again, a private space for contemplation, for absorbing the enormity of what had happened. He looked out at the darkening street. The lone lamppost cast a small circle of light, a beacon in the growing dusk. He thought of the writer of the letter, of their courage in finally breaking the silence, in offering a truth that must have been as painful to write as it was for him to receive. There was no anger left in him now, only a profound, aching sadness and a nascent, fragile sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the truth, however late it had come. Gratitude for the chance to finally understand, to see the past not as a fixed, immutable monolith of pain, but as a complex tapestry of human frailty, of fear, of love, and of choices made in impossible circumstances. The breakdown on the sidewalk had been a necessary catharsis, a purging of emotions held in check for too long. It had been raw, brutal, but also in its own way cleansing. He felt scoured, stripped bare, but also lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his soul. He carefully folded the letter, its creases now a testament to the storm it had unleashed, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket, next to his heart. He placed the piece of wood there too, the two objects nestled together, a chronicle of a hidden history, now brought into the light. The silence in the cab was no longer oppressive, but reflective, filled with the unspoken echoes of the past, and the quiet promise of a future that might, just might, be different. He was still the same man, weathered, scarred, but something within him had shifted, realigned. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a more nuanced, more compassionate understanding. The journey ahead was uncertain, but he would face it, as he always had, with quiet determination, and now, perhaps, with a heart a little more open, a little less guarded. The streetlights hummed, their glow painting the quiet street in hues of orange and shadow. He sat in the truck for a long time, the engine silent, the windows slightly fogged from his breath. The immediate, overwhelming force of the emotional tempest had passed, leaving in its wake a profound stillness, an almost unnerving calm. It was the quiet after a storm, when the air is washed clean and the world seems to hold its breath, waiting. He replayed the words of the letter in his mind, not with the initial shock and pain, but with a growing sense of understanding, piecing together the fragmented narrative of his past with these new, vital truths. The anger he had harbored for so long, a cold, hard knot in his gut, had dissolved, replaced by a deep, empathetic sorrow for all of them, for himself, for the writer, for the third person whose memory had been so long shrouded in misunderstanding. They had all been victims, in their own ways, of circumstance, of fear, of the human inability to communicate the deepest truths of the heart when they mattered most. He thought of the years lost to silence, the connections severed, the misunderstandings allowed to fester. There was an undeniable tragedy, a waste of precious time. But the letter, in its raw honesty, had offered not just an explanation, but a form of belated reconciliation, not necessarily with the writer in person, but with the past itself. It was a chance to reframe his own history, to see it not as a story of betrayal or abandonment, but as a more complex, more human tale of flawed individuals struggling with unbearable burdens. The small piece of seaworn wood felt different in his pocket now. It was still a memento of loss, but it was also a symbol of survival, of truths that eventually find their way to the surface, like wreckage washed ashore after a great storm. It spoke of endurance, not just his own, but the endurance of love, however battered, however long suppressed. He finally reached for the ignition key, his hand steady now. The old engine turned over with a familiar, reassuring rumble. He switched on the headlights, their beams cutting through the encroaching darkness. He didn't know where he was going, not exactly. There were no grand plans, no sudden resolutions to old conflicts. The letter hadn't asked for a response, and he wasn't sure he was ready to offer one, even if he knew how. But something had changed within him. The rigid posture he usually maintained seemed a little softer, the lines around his eyes less harsh, more reflective. The world outside his windshield, once a place he navigated with guarded stoicism, now seemed imbued with a new layer of meaning, a deeper sense of shared human experience. He pulled away from the curb, the old truck moving slowly down the quiet. He glanced once more at the spot on the sidewalk where he had broken down, a place that would now be etched in his memory, not as a site of shame, but as a place of profound, necessary release. The journey ahead was still his own, solitary in many ways, but he no longer felt quite so alone with his past. The letter had been a bridge, however fragile, across the chasm of years, a whisper of connection in a lifetime of silence. And that, he realized, was a gift, however painful its delivery. The weight in his chest had eased, replaced by a quiet, almost melancholic peace. The truth had been spoken, and he had listened. As he drove, the city lights blurred into streaks of color, a stark contrast to the inner landscape he was navigating. The raw emotion had subsided, leaving a thoughtful quietude in its place. He found himself re-examining old memories, viewing them through the new lens the letter had provided. Incidents that had once seemed clear-cut, defined by his own limited perspective, now revealed hidden facets, unspoken motivations, the subtle interplay of fear and love that had driven the actions of others. It was like looking at a familiar photograph and suddenly noticing details in the background that changed the entire meaning of the scene. He realized how much of his life had been shaped by assumptions, by narratives he had constructed to make sense of events he couldn't fully comprehend at the time. The letter had not erased the pain of the past, but it had contextualized it, humanized it. The villains of his story were revealed as simply people, flawed and struggling, making difficult choices under immense pressure. This understanding didn't excuse the hurt, but it softened its edges, replacing a brittle anger with a more profound, more compassionate sorrow. He thought of the writer's courage. It must have taken an immense effort to pen those words, to lay bare old wounds, to risk reopening a connection that had been severed for so long. There was a generosity in that act, a desire for truth that transcended personal pride or fear of rejection. He felt a grudging respect, perhaps even a nascent sense of forgiveness, not just for the writer, but for himself, for the years he had spent locked in his own silent. The small piece of sea-worn wood in his pocket felt like a quiet anchor. It had been with him through the darkest times, a constant, unchanging presence. Now, it seemed to have absorbed the new truths, its significance deepening, evolving. It was a reminder that even the hardest, most battered things could endure, could carry within them a story of resilience. He drove aimlessly for a while, letting the rhythm of the road soothe him. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He was simply moving, processing, allowing the revelations to settle. The city, with its millions of lives, its countless untold stories, felt less alien, less indifferent. He was a part of it, connected by the shared human experiences of love, loss, regret, and the eternal search for meaning. The emotional breakdown on the sidewalk, though intensely private, had in a strange way reconnected him to that shared humanity. In his vulnerability, he had found a new kind of strength, the strength that comes from acknowledging one's own wounds, one's own frailties. The stoic facade had been necessary for a time, a shield against a world that often seemed too harsh. But perhaps, he mused, it was time to let some of that armor go. The letter had shown him that true strength lay not in impenetrable silence, but in the courage to speak, to listen, and to understand. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever see the writer of the letter again, or if he even wanted to. But he knew that he would move forward differently, carrying the weight of his past, not as a burden, but as a source of wisdom, of empathy. The silence had been broken, and in its place, there was now the quiet hum of understanding, the faint, hopeful melody of a truth finally acknowledged. The journey had no specific destination, but as he drove, he found himself heading towards the coast, drawn by an instinct he didn't question. The city thinned, replaced by darker, quieter roads, the scent of salt beginning to tinge the air. He finally pulled over at a familiar overlook, a place he hadn't visited in years. The same desolate stretch of coastline where he had found the piece of sea-worn wood so long ago. He switched off the engine, the silence now filled with the distant roar of the ocean, the cry of a solitary gull. He stepped out of the truck, the wind cold and sharp against his face. He walked to the edge of the bluff, looking out at the vast, dark expanse of water, the waves crashing against the rocks below with a timeless, rhythmic power. This place had been a witness to his deepest sorrow, the silent keeper of his unspoken grief. Now it felt different, less a place of desolation, more a place of profound, stark beauty. He reached into his pocket and took out the piece of wood. He held it up, its dark silhouette stark against the moonlit water. It felt like an offering, a release. He then took out the letter, its pages rustling in the... He didn't read it again. He knew its contents by heart now. He simply held it, feeling the weight of the words, the years of silence they represented, and the fragile hope they now contained. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping his hair, the immensity of the ocean stretching out before him. He felt small, insignificant against the vastness of nature, yet also strangely connected, a part of something larger, something eternal. The pain was still there, a dull ache in his heart, but it was no longer a sharp, consuming fire. It was a part of him, integrated, understood. The letter had not provided easy answers, nor a simple resolution. It had offered something far more valuable, truth, and with it, the possibility of peace. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back in his pocket, alongside the piece of wood. They belonged together now, two halves of story finally made whole. He turned his back to the ocean and walked towards his truck. The journey back would be long, but he felt ready for it. The man who had driven out to the coast was not quite the same man who would drive back. Something had been broken, yes, but something had also been mended in the quiet, unseen depths of his soul. The silence within him was no longer a void, but a space filled with a new, hard-won understanding. The letter, a voice from the past, had given him back a piece of himself he hadn't even realized was missing. And as he started the engine, the old truck rumbling to life, he knew, with a quiet certainty, that he would carry that truth with him always.